Hello, my creative friends, and welcome to another episode of The Daily Prompt. Happy Friday. I hope you've enjoyed this week. We've been talking about specific sort of story approach, thinking, big picture of how story works, the big picture of character building, of opposition building, of the building blocks of story itself. Today, what I want to talk about is, what are you trying to say? We had a couple of questions about theme and premise. We had a little bit of a discussion slash debate slash seemingly heated argument. I was not arguing anything. My biggest challenge with theme and the idea of what you're trying to say through your story is that I think a lot of teachers and people who try to discuss some of these ideas, they try to distill a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about this week, of story structure, of story ideas, of how to go about building story. They discern it academically. You look at what exists, and you look at all the different stories, you look at the ones that work and the ones that don't, and you try to identify what are the elements that make those stories work, and you're sort of trying to break down how story works. And I think one of the big challenges that we run into is that story is very much unique. Story is the most effective way to tell a story depends upon the story idea that you have. It depends upon what you're trying to say. It depends on how you're trying to say it and how you want to go about connecting with the audience to give them the experience of what it is you're trying to say. My contention, as is probably clear by now, is that every story is going to say something, whether you intend for it to say what it's saying, or whether it's simply a message or an idea that the audience interprets based upon how they perceive the character going through and making the choices that they make and having the outcome that they have in the story that you tell. So ultimately, one of the big things I want to discuss today is this idea of theme. So one of the questions that came up was, can you explain the difference between theme and premise? Well, theme and premise are very different things. In the screenwriting world, when we say premise, a movie's premise, we're basically talking about the situation of the story. So a premise might be, a bumbling band of bank robbers pull off a bank heist and get trapped in the safe, right? Like, that's your basic premise of a movie, for example. A theme is what you're trying to say through that story. A theme would be something, your theme for that very movie might be something like the income inequality levels are such that it causes people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do in situations that they're not quite capable of, right? So that might be a theme. Or another theme might be, I don't know, you can think of different messages that you're trying to get across. You can think of different things that you're trying to say through that story. And depending on what you're trying to say, depending on how you're trying to say it, it's going to determine what choices you make in that story. If you were trying to thematically talk about income inequality, you're going to be looking at the characters, their opposition, the sequences of the story. You're going to be including story that ultimately conveys that message or that theme. You're going to make choices within the story that evoke the income inequality or whatever it might be. So that would be just one potential theme relevant to today that you could express through that story, but also through the bank heist story. You could be thematically arguing against right and wrong. Is right and wrong subjective based upon your viewpoint? That could thematically be what your story is about. That could be thematically what you're trying to say to the audience. And so then the choices that you make are going to be all about right and wrong, and who's making which choices and how they define those choices, and your interpretation of what a right choice leads to is going to determine the audience perceiving that as a right choice or a wrong choice. If your argument, if your theme, if what you're trying to say or present is not clear to the audience, or if the way that you present it misses its mark somehow, the audience can quite easily take away an entirely different thematic message, an entirely different point. So one of the things we got into in the comments was talking about this idea of using theme as a sort of prerequisite or as a requirement for designing your story. Is it propaganda, for example, to have a theme and try to steer someone towards your message? And I first of all, in my system, I talk about theme because it's something that writers need to understand and need to know, just why I'm talking about it right now with you. But I don't actually think theme needs to be the driver of a story. I think every writer is unique. I think every story is unique. I don't think theme has to be, I don't think you have to have a well-defined theme in every story. I think it's entirely okay or possible, it's quite effective in a lot of cases, to not have a very specifically defined theme so that the audience has to discern the theme or has to figure out their interpretation of the story. And that could lead to a very powerful story that ultimately has different people taking different things away from it because they're interpreting it in a different way. Here's the thing to understand. Every person on the planet sees the world through their own unique window. And because of that, the things that we watch and the things that we witness, we're going to interpret them in different ways. We're going to interpret them through our perspective. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. That gave me a very specific worldview. When I moved to Australia, and I've lived in Australia and New Zealand for the better part of 15 years, I began to see the world differently because my point of view changed dramatically. It wasn't just sort of this America/Hollywood-centric view of the world. It was really, what does the world look like to other people? The Australians that I met and the New Zealanders that I came to become great friends with had decidedly different points of view about a lot of things. And by understanding that point of view, I can see that when I watch a movie, let's say a Hollywood film, and it has very Hollywood-centric ideas that make a lot of sense to my brain as someone from Hollywood, but then I look at that same movie through the lens of someone elsewhere in the world that doesn't have the sort of archetypal, rah-rah, pro-capitalist sort of ideology of what American Hollywood movies put out, then you're going to interpret not just the overall film, but the character choices. You're going to interpret the subtle little messages in very radically different ways. So when you're making your movie, when you're telling your story, you have to understand that audiences are going to interpret things very differently. If your character makes a choice that to your brain, to your thinking, is very logical, leads directly to this outcome, someone somewhere else on the planet may watch that same thing and think, that choice doesn't make that person good, that choice makes that person evil, for example, right? So if you're talking let's talk in archetypes. If you talk about capitalism versus communism, right? So a person who really grew up and fundamentally understands the sort of communistic mindset, because that's the world they were raised in, they're going to look at certain things that maybe a capitalist sort of greed-driven person is going to, they're going to see those choices, they're going to interpret those choices in very different ways. So you can have a movie, one of the discussions that came up in the, and it's not capitalism, communism, but one of the discussions that came up in the comments was the movie of Casablanca, and how Casablanca looks very different to a certain audience as to another audience based upon what it was thematically trying to achieve. Now, the reason that I want to point this out is because when you're creating your story, when you're creating your movie, there's two things to understand. You are telling the audience something. You are expressing a point of view. You are expressing a worldview. You are expressing something thematically, whether you pinpoint it and identify it or not. the audience is going to perceive that from their point of view. So if you're creating something for a target audience, you know what that audience is, you understand how that audience thinks, you understand how they will interpret what you create, well, then you're going to have a much greater chance of being aligned with that audience. If you create something and you don't know who your audience is and you don't know what your ultimate message is, and you send it out into the world and the audience has a different take on things, they understand things differently, they're going to interpret your story in a different way. Now, maybe that's fine, maybe that's good, maybe that works because you've told a story with universal themes, or maybe it rubs them the wrong way. Maybe it's completely misaligned. Maybe it's something that the audience actively dislikes because of what it is you're trying to say and how you're trying to say it. As I have said many times before, there is no such thing as right or wrong in the world of creativity. There just isn't. What there is effective or ineffective. So if you're trying to say something and you don't understand your audience and you don't understand how that theme will land with your audience, you don't understand how the audience will interpret what it is that you've created, you stand a much greater chance of missing your mark, of missing the target. If instead you understand what you're trying to say, you understand how you're trying to say it, you stand a better chance of landing with that audience. Now, there's many ways of writing a story and creating a screenplay as there are writers on the planet. There's no right or wrong way to do it. You can create something that is thematically driven. A lot of the screenwriting educational material out there says that you have to identify your theme, that you have to have a theme, that you have to write to a theme. And I just don't necessarily believe that or agree with that. You can, if it helps you. You can, if it creates a stronger end result for you. But ultimately, you don't have to. You can write in an exploratory way. You can find your theme through the act of creating your story. There's no right or wrong, and there's no one way to do it. And the way that I promote is it helps you understand the idea so that the tool is there if you need it, but it's entirely up to you whether you use it, whether you apply it, and how you apply it. So when we talk about theme, ultimately, when we talk about what it is you're trying to say with your story, you can be actively trying to change minds. You can be passively just showing your observation of how things are in the world, or you can simply not look or address it at all. So what I want you to do today, when you think about today's daily prompt, is I want you to think about what are you trying to say with the story that you're creating? What are you trying to say? What do you want your audience to take away from your story? Are you trying to change their mind? Are you trying to make an argument about something? One of the greatest challenges that writers have is when you have a message that you want to put out there to the world. There is nothing wrong with putting a message out there into the world, with saying, if you behave like this, it leads to a better outcome. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that you run the risk of getting preachy. One of the big challenges writers have when we talk about theme, or when we talk about the message that you're trying to convey to the audience, is that you don't understand the way to convey a message effectively is to convey both the message and the counter message, the argument against the message, and you have to give them equal weight so that the message that you want to get across ultimately wins in the end. So, for example, if you were going to talk about communism versus capitalism, right? And by the way, I'm not debating which one's more effective or which one's more powerful or whatever. The more you immerse into different ways of looking at the world, if you travel, if you go to countries where people have completely different mindsets, you can start to see why people think the way that they do. So I don't get into which way's better, Democrat versus Republican, right versus left. I don't get into any of that kind of stuff, simply because I understand both points of view, and I understand why people think the way that they do, and I let people think the way that they do. But if I was going to write something for one or the other, and I wanted to be pro this or pro this, what you would want to do if you're trying to convey that message is understand what the message is, understand why you're saying one is more or less powerful than the other, and then have the counter argument and make sure that that counter argument gets equally measured so that it really is a discussion between the two. If you make whatever you believe in so strong and whatever the opposing point of view is so weak, that's when it gets preachy. When you overpower with a flawed argument of the other point of view. The only way to see this, the only way to understand this, the only way to present an opposing point of view is to really put your head in that mindset. Politically, we live in very polarized times right now. And the reason we live in such polarized times is because nobody's willing to put their mind into the other person's point of view. One side is not right and the other side is wrong. It's not. It's simply never the case. The people who believe this way have very well thought, well argued ideas for why they believe this way. That's why they get so passionate about it. The people who believe this way, equally the same. They've thought this through. They have very passionate reasons why they believe these things. If you simply vilify the other side, you're creating a story with heroes and villains that are two-dimensional, with a twirling mustache bad guy. If you vilify whoever the other side is, whichever point of view you have about anything in life, if you vilify the other side as the twirling mustache bad guy, you are two-dimensionalizing the argument. The way to make a theme effective, the way to actually get across an idea, the way to actually change minds is to present both as three-dimensional characters, as three-dimensional situations, as three-dimensional belief systems, and understand that there are nuances to both. The most effective argument is going to treat both with dignity and respect and fill out the picture. And then whichever one that you're trying to get across is going to be the one that's going to edge out the win in the end. Does it make sense? I'm oversimplifying, and I know that I'm oversimplifying, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to get a comment or something saying, that's not true in this case or whatever. Okay, fine. The point that I'm coming back to with all this, the essence that I'm trying to get across in this particular video is that theme, or the idea of what your story is saying, is nuanced and complex. At the end of the day, simply by the way the human brain works, we observe things and we create meaning out of them. If you slipped and fell today on your way to work, your brain is going to attach meaning to that. How did that happen? What does that mean? Was I doing something I shouldn't have been doing? Our brain just does this instinctively. It's why we're drawn to stories. So to think that your story doesn't have a meaning or shouldn't convey a meaning is simply just not understanding A, how the brain works, and B, how story taps into it. So you can include that story, you can include what you're trying to say intentionally by design or not. And either way is fine, but ultimately my belief is that the greater you understand what your objective is, the greater you understand how to reach that objective. So if you're trying to say something, or you know the audience that you're trying to target, then you want to make sure that what you're saying is going to land with that audience, that is going to resonate with that audience. If I'm going to make a science fiction story and I throw science to the wind and I don't use any, I create a bunch of pseudoscience gobbledygook to explain the story that I'm telling, then that's not going to land very effectively with my target audience of science audience or sci-fi lovers, right? So similarly, if you have a message that you want to get across, or you want to say something with your story, if you don't understand who your target is, you don't understand how they're going to be interpreting the story that you're creating, it's going to be very easy to miss the mark and create something that does not resonate with them, which either won't sell, won't get made, or if it does, won't actually land with an audience terribly effectively. So today's daily prompt, let's make this personal. Let's turn this into something for you. So today's daily prompt is all about figuring out what is it that you're trying to say. What do you want to say to the audience? Do you want it to be specific? Do you want it to be something like a message, some actual takeaway, maybe a line of dialogue and be popped into your story that reflects what your actual theme is? Or do you want it to be a little bit more ambiguous? Do you want it to be discussing or thematically addressing some situation, but never really coming down on one side or the other? Or do you simply want to just create your story, see where it goes, and whatever the meaning or message comes out of it, then go back and reshape your project to more effectively serve that message? Or simply leave it by the wayside and let the audience interpret however they will. There is no right or wrong, and it really depends on your idea and what you're trying to get across. So that's today's daily prompt. Take a little bit of time to really process this, filter it through your own experience and your own imagination. Don't just jump into the next video. Actually process, ponder, think about this, and then take action. I know it's Friday. I know you're looking forward to the weekend if you're watching this in real time, or syncing it up with the days of the week if you're watching this in the future. But ultimately, every day you need to take action. A little bit of action, 10 minutes a day is all you really need to just keep chipping away at that. If you really continue to keep chipping away at it, you will get where you're trying to go. If you've been really chipping away at it through this whole series so far, you've done pretty well so far. We're a month and a half or something into this. That's consistent action every single day. You're developing a habit. You're making this a regular thing for you. There's no stopping you as long as you continue moving forward and taking action. So go take action now. We'll see you tomorrow.